Good evening, everyone. Welcome to e-flux. My name is Stephen. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight on this formerly rainy but now slightly less rainy evening. It's a real pleasure to introduce the one and only Jodi Dean, who most of you will have heard of. She has written, I just counted, 12 books, is that right, over the past 20 years? Most recently, Crowds and Party from Verso, which I will quote from by way of a longer, in place of a longer introduction. And then Jodi will speak to us about her preliminary notes for a theory of the comrade. So this is from the end of the book where she's talking about what the Communist Party is and is not. It's a couple pages, so it'll probably take me 4 minutes, and then I'll get out of the way and leave you guys to Jodi. At different points over the past 100 years, the party has attempted to abolish capitalism and usher in communism in various ways. Revolutionary seizure of the state, participation in parliamentary processes, training of cadres and education of masses in order to be prepared when the time comes, support and development of people's cultures and capacities. The Communist Party has never been simply an organization aimed at achieving a set of economic reforms, aimed at restraining capitalism's extremes and providing workers with welfare guarantees. That this is the case is clear when we note the justified sense of betrayal voiced by communists when their parties compromise and retreat. They feel betrayed because the party gave way on communist desire, the very desire its wide array of organizations hold open, the desire underpinning solidarity and comradeship. The array of classic party organizations, newspapers, literary magazines, clubs, trade associations, sports teams, schools, theater troupes, women's groups, industry-focused councils, to mention but a few, remind us that communist parties have always exceeded the binary of state and factory, actively engaging on multiple social, cultural, and economic fronts as elements of one struggle. As a red thread throughout the movements of the oppressed, communists connected divergent issues and experiences, enlarging them into a common world and mobilizing the collective desire for collectivity. Unlike standard parliamentary parties claiming representative authority, the work of the Communist Party involves substantialization, concentration, extension, and transference. Hence, communist values of comradeship, solidarity, enthusiasm, and courage support the building of a political organization capable of responding in a revolutionary situation and enduring in less precipitous times. Through the party, members push each other into modes of being and acting that appeared impossible before, when they were alone against capital and its state. The problem the left encounters today is less a matter of organizational details than it is of solidary political will. As the will emerges, people will figure out the structure in light of the challenges we face in specific contexts. Challenges such as expanding militant pressure in ways that inspire and educate cadres, while at the same time straining the resources of the state and breaking the confidence of the financial sector. Abolishing private property and the capitalist banking system while advancing international coordination in an uneven environment. And increasing popular support of and developing a program for common management of production, health, transportation, communication, food, housing, and education, all in a setting of a changing climate, to mention but a few. Responding to these variable challenges generates new knowledge that can be integrated and shared. There is no reason to assume that every component of the party must have the same structure. A global alliance of the radical left, or better, a new party of communists, can be knit together from the concentrated forces of already existing groups. Militants skilled at direct action, artists adept with symbols and slogans, parties experienced at organizing, issue groups knowledgeable about specific areas of concern, mutual aid networks addressing basic needs. Such a concentration would let people who want to be engaged in radical politics but aren't sure what to do have a place to go, a place to start. In addition to a common name, we have to build solidarity, to extend the bonds of commitment beyond local ties and small networks. Without solidarity, a common will cannot emerge. Immiseration, precarity, defeat, and betrayal, as well as ongoing patterns of sexism, racism, and homophobia, have made us deeply suspicious. One way a party helps deal with this is with explicit criteria for membership and expectations for members. It supplements personal relations with relations to an organization, holding members accountable to expectations. Relations between comrades overlay and replace particularized relations anchored in individual preference. Practices of regular reporting help install these expectations. Another way a party builds solidarity is by acknowledging different skills and expertise, providing training and education, and delegating tasks. Developing and respecting one another's skills and knowledge is essential if we are to form ourselves into a political force capable of taking on and replacing global capitalism. In practice, this suggests the utility of working groups in multiple locales and issue areas, groups with enough autonomy to be responsive, and enough integration via practices of reporting to formulate and carry out a common purpose. It points as well to the active development of the organizational and political capacities crucial to multiscalar communist self-governance. The crowd has pushed this left anti-party dogma mobilizes anti-authoritarian convictions. Yet this mobilization has resulted in the intensified authoritarianism of global capitalism. Today, authoritarianism is less that of a centralized state power than it is of power decentralized, dispersed, and extended via private contracts, interbank and interagency cooperation, and the extensive network of treaties, agreements, and provisions enabling capital flow and global trade. National states act as the police force protecting the global capitalist class. We encounter the fragmentation, dissolution, and decomposition of some elements of the state, and the concentration and intermeshing of other elements of states and markets, as in finance, security, and media. Capital as a class has worked to smash the bureaucratic state machine for us, to convince us that it is useless, even as it strengthens parts of its own for its own ends. For too long, left politics in the US, UK, and EU has mirrored neoliberal economics, urging decentralization, flexibility, and innovation. Even the neoliberal push to privatize is reflected in left politics. Not only do we hear ad infinitum that the personal is political, but the micropolitics of self-transformation and DIY takes the place of building and occupying institutions with duration. In this vein, some on the left have abandoned social change entirely. Wary of, quote, totalizing visions, they cede society and the state to a capitalist class that acts as a global political class intent on extending its reach into and strengthening its hold over our lives and futures. The crowd has pushed this left aside, rising up in opposition to the decentralized authoritarianisms of interconnected states and markets. It has occupied, blockaded, and rioted, and it has come up against the limits of its capacity to give social struggles political form. The challenge we face is becoming the left the crowd deserves, a left that, faithful to the crowd's egalitarian discharge, works to make it endure. A left that speaks the language of radical change, but refuses its forms, is no left at all. It's the means by which political energy and conviction is displaced into styles and practices that make us feel good by making us feel radical. To advance, we need to organize. We need to be a party for the people and the crowd. Jodi Dean.
Thanks so much. I appreciate the introduction. That also helps. You can tell where I'm coming from that. The talk tonight was sort of instigated after Trump's election in November, when the Left Book weekly compilation included a line from Jeb Brandt that said, "Comrades, not allies. Can we try that?" I was excited about this because I've been in the early stages of a project on the Comrade, right, which comes right out of Crowds and Party. But I haven't had much of an opportunity to really do the work on it. And so far, the work has been relatively eclectic reading and then multiple discussions with comrades, including Oksana Timofeyeva, Maria Chehanadsky, Alexei Penzin, and Alla Ivanchikova, and others I've met at a number of different meetings and conferences and in the course of political work. So I decided to use the opportunity that e-flux has provided, and thank you very much for the invitation, to try to get down some preliminary notes for a larger theory of the Comrade. So I'm going to set these out tonight, and time permitting, try to return at the end, maybe in the discussion, to the larger setting and our need for comradeship today. In a sense, comrades were already in the air. Wait, let's go back here. Okay, and let's play this.
Of the Democratic Party here tonight, Mr. Bernie Sanders. There he is. 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 There he is Bernie, you look like $1,000,000. Or to put it in terms you'll understand, you look like 37,000 donations of $27 each. A lot of folks have been surprised by the Bernie phenomenon, especially his appeal to young people, but not me. I get it. Just recently, a young person came up to me and said she was sick of politicians standing in the way of her dreams. As if we were actually going to let Malia go to Burning Man this year. Was not going to happen. Bernie might have let her go. Not us. I am hurt, though, Bernie, that you've been distancing yourself a little from me. I mean, that's just not something that you do to your comrade.
I want to unpack this a little bit, right? Some of the layers of the joke. So obviously the first layer is Bernie the socialist, right? And so on the one hand, there might be a little bit of red baiting going on. On the other hand, there's the complication, is Bernie in the Democratic Party, right? Is he Obama's party comrade, or is he not? And then there's another layer, and that's, you see these images, these are, I Googled them, they're from a bunch of right-wing sites. For the last 8 years, the far right has attacked Obama as a communist. So the joke points not just to Bernie as a comrade, but in a way to Obama as a comrade. Someone also committed, at least in right-wing parlance, also committed to emancipatory egalitarian struggle, someone with communism as the horizon of his politics. And then the joke also includes not just who is a comrade, but what are the expectations of a comrade, right? It's not about the identity, it's about expectations for action. If you're a comrade, you don't publicly distance yourself, even a little bit, from the party, right? Comradeship binds action. And also, as the right-wing portrayals of Obama as a comrade also demonstrate, the comradeship of communists opens to a future, right? To hope and possibilities for change. Now, the right-wing version wants to disparage these openings to change, but it recognizes them. It recognizes that when communists refer to each other as comrades, they're part of an open project. So that's how comradeship is kind of in the air, even in mass culture. What I want to do as I start to set out more some of the provisional theses for a theory of the comrade is I want to give you some background about the project and then go into some of the theses that I have. So first, I'm a political theorist. That's my field. And political theorists have investigated a whole bunch of different political figures. Right? They think about political figures in terms of power relations. They think about power relations in terms of figures that personify it. These political figures or figures of political relation are usually developed with respect to responsibilities, obligations, expectations that accompany a particular political figure. So, for example, in the history of political ideas, there's The Prince, right? Everybody probably has read Machiavelli's The Prince, an account of political relation now figured through a specific figure. There's a slew in the history of political ideas, a slew of treatises on monarchy and kingship. There are accounts of offices like the dictator. Carl Schmitt has a book on the dictator. Also in the history of political ideas, there's multiple investigations of the citizen and citizenship. And again, all of these figures are ways that political theorists will talk about power relations and obligations. Other figures, lord and vassal, master and slave, bourgeois and proletarian, the neighbor, the stranger, friends and enemies. Again, all commonly discussed in the 2,000-year so-called history of so-called Western political thought. Also, familial relations, almost always construed in terms of the reproductive heterosexual family, but you get accounts of the relation between spouses, husband and wife, or between parents and children. So History of Ideas has all sorts of theory around political relations, but there has not been a specific and direct account of the comrade. In American political thought, this might not be a huge surprise. The neglect of the comrade fits, we could easily think is probably part of the legacy of the Cold War. But also, very few socialist and communist theorists have reflected systematically on the characteristics and expectations of comrades. One exception is Alexandra Kollontai, another is Maxim Gorky, and they don't give systematic or analytical explications of the comrade as a political figure, but they do give us an affective opening into the promise of comradeship. In her writings on prostitution, sex, and the family from the initial years of the Bolshevik Revolution, Kollontai presents comradeship and solidarity as the sensitivities or affects or feelings necessary for building a communist society. Kollontai associates comradeship with, quote, a feeling of belongingness, a relation among free and equal communist workers. Another quote, in place of the individual and egoistic family, a great universal family of workers will develop, in which all the workers, men and women, will above all be comrades, end quote. Comrade points to a mode of being together opposed to the isolation, hierarchy, and oppression of bourgeois forms of relation, particularly of the family under capitalism. It's a mode of equality and respect. In Russian, the word comrade is gender neutral, so it replaces gendered modes of address. Gorky has a short story from the early 20th century, which was actually published in English in 1906 in the American utopian socialist magazine, The Comrade. And the Gorky story is simply called Comrade. And it's completely over the top. And it's a testimony to the power of the word comrade. And he presents it as a word with life-giving power, a word that, quote, had come to unite the whole world, to lift all men up to the summits of liberty and bind with new ties, the strong ties of mutual respect, end quote. So in the story, and the story it's really short. It begins with a strange city, and the city is all gloomy, and he calls it a torturous city, and he describes deformed people and weak people being forced to submit to the strong. He describes a city of misery and general hostility, violence, suffering, humiliation, and rage. It's just horrible, right? Really horrible, horrible, horrible. And then one word rings out, comrade. And the people cease to be slaves. They refuse to submit. They become conscious of their strength. They recognize that they themselves are the force of life. I mean, his examples are wonderful, again, because they're over the top, right? He has one, describes the weary prostitute in the street, and she feels the hand of a strange man on her shoulder, weeps with joy when, what does he say? Comrade, right? And then there's the beggar and the coachman, and then young combatants, and then comrade shines like a star and guides them all to the future. Like Kollontai then, Gorky associates the word comrade with freedom from servitude and oppression, with equality. He presents it in opposition to the exploitation, misery, and hierarchy of capitalist egoism. Like Kollontai, he links comradeship to a struggle and to a vision of the future when we will all be comrades. I'll add that the American journal I mentioned, the early 20th century one from the utopian socialist, The Comrade, is also filled with really romantic and enthusiastic celebrations of the relations between comrades. The American journal was inspired in part by Walt Whitman's manly love of comrades, in ways that in the journal they don't omit its homoeroticism, homosociality, and celebratory queerness. For example, in the journal, The Comrade, there's a short story called The Tomboy, in which the tomboy tries to save a poor woman from her brutal husband, and failing to do so, nevertheless expresses gratitude that she herself will never be a woman. The whole queerness of the comrade, which again, present in this early American journal, is now also explicitly part of contemporary China, where the term comrade, tongji, also means gay. And you saw the thing from a Chinese TV show, Queer Comrades. Another couple of things from the American journal, Ultra Romantic and Over the Top. It published lots of different poems. One was called A Song of Tomorrow by George D. Herron. And that poem dreamed of comrade love, which will fill the world. And then there's another poem by Edwin Markham called The Love of Comrades. And that one evoked comrade bees, which is why we have the comrade bees up there. And then another poem by Herron called From Gods to Men. And in that one, it was in the 3rd issue of the journal, comrade is a prefix. So there's comrade day, comrade home, comrade march, comrade future, comrade stars. The Russian constructivist Alexander Rodchenko expanded the field of comradeship even further to include comrade things, comrade objects. In 1925, he writes, "Our things in our hands must also be equals, also comrades." So these examples then from the Bolsheviks and the poems published in the Comrade give us a view of comradeship linked to a vision of the future, one characterized by equality and belonging, love and respect between equals so great that it can't be contained in human relations, but spans to include insects and galaxies, bees and stars, and objects themselves. The word comrade marks the division between the world of misery we have and the egalitarian communist or socialist world that we see. And again, just to add in return to the Chinese example, just as in Russian revolutionary history, so in Chinese does the idea of comrade or tongji replace hierarchical and gendered designations of relation with an ideal of egalitarianism and utopianism. According to Heng Wei Bao, tongji is intrinsically queer. It maps social relations in a new way, a way that opens the traditional family and kinship structure to relations and connections between strangers who share the same political views. And it transforms private intimacy into public intimacy. Well, for many of us today, perhaps especially here in the US, but probably you can say the UK and the EU as well, what we see is societies that are ever more nationalist and authoritarian. We see societies of intensified inequality and immiseration, of anthropocenic exhaustion. And it sometimes seems hard to recapture the hope, the futurity and sense of shared struggle of these 100-year-old texts. So what is comradeship for us? My wager is that what I'm going to just call, for the sake of, basically I'm going to use a fancy name for being really eclectic, a speculative analytic account of comradeship, one that I hope will let us draw out the specificity of the relation between comrades, I think might be able to provide us with a view of political relation necessary for the present. So I'm calling this speculative analytic because I don't want it to be, it's not exactly the same as past usages, but I'm drawing from past usages to try to schematize it and schematize some of these past usages in an analytic way. So to that end then, I'll have 4 theses on the comrade. And so the first one will begin by asking, it'll be an answer to the question, who is the comrade? And the answer to the question, who is the comrade, will give us our first thesis. And the first thesis, again, these are provisional, and I'm doing this hoping to get feedback on these, but the first thesis is anyone but not everyone can be a comrade. And I owe this to Oksana Timofeyeva, who also provided me with this example. So this next example here.
Oh, this is a fine thing. Maybe we've missed him already.
How can we find somebody without knowing what he looks like?
That must be the one.
Yes, he looks like a comrade.
Yes.
Heil Hitler.
No, that's not him.
Positively not.
So what are we going to do now?
I don't know.
This is... We must have missed him. Be the one who sent...
I'm looking for Michael Simonovich Ironov.
I am Michael Simonovich Ironov.
I'm Nina Ivanovna Yakushova, envoy extraordinary, acting on the direct orders of Comrade Commissar Rosinin. Present with your colleagues.
Comrade Polyanov.
Comrade,
Comrade Kopalsky.
comrade,
What a charming idea for Moscow to surprise us with a lady, comrade.
If we had known, we would have greeted you with flowers.
Yes.
don't make an issue of my womanhood. We're here for work, all of us. Let's not waste any time. Shall we go?
Porter.
Here, please.
What do you want?
May I have your bags, madame?
Why?
He's a porter. He wants to carry them.
Why? Why should you carry other people's bags?
Well, that's my business, madame.
That's no business. That's social injustice.
That depends on the tip.
Allow me.
No, thank you.
Okay, so this is from Ernst Lubitsch's famous movie, Ninotchka. And as we saw, Iranov, Bulyanov, and Kopalsky, who are minor Soviet trade officials in Paris trying to negotiate a sale of jewels confiscated from Russian aristocrats, are looking for their comrade from Moscow. It could be anyone, but not everyone. Some people are clearly not comrades, right? They're enemies. Iranov, Bulyanov, and Kopalsky can't figure out who their comrade is by looking at them. Identity has nothing to do with comradeship. Nina Ivanova Yakushova, Greta Garbo, is insistent on this. That she is a woman is to be disregarded. She is a comrade. So a subsequent thesis then follows from this. Comrade names a relation that is at the same time a division. Comradeship is premised on inclusion and exclusion. Not everyone can be a comrade. It is not an infinitely open or flexible relation, but one premised on division and struggle. There is an enemy. But unlike Carl Schmitt's classic account of the political in terms of the intensity between the division between friend and enemy, comradeship doesn't concern the enemy. The fact of an enemy, of struggle, is the condition, the setting of comradeship, but it doesn't determine the relation between comrades. Comrades are those on the same side of the division. With respect to the division, they are the same. Their sameness is that of those who are on the same side. To say comrade is to announce a belonging and the sameness that comes from belonging on the same side. We can see this expression in terms like comrade in arms, right? Military expressions of comradeship, right? Again, there's an enemy, but the relation of comrade in arms is not to the enemy, but to the ones with whom one stands together in relation to that enemy. That's also one of the ways that the term comrade is not the same as the term partisan, because partisan names a relation to an enemy. So again, in saying that anyone but not everyone can be a comrade, we get at the way comradeship designates a relation and a division, us and them. It's a political relation, but it's a political relation that's not the same as that between friend and enemy, which is an absolute and exclusive state relation. In comradeship, there's a space of possibility. Anyone can be a comrade, but not everyone. So then the second thesis is comrade names a divisive political relation. Now we can kind of think about this one by distinguishing the comrade from other sorts of relations. So the comrade's not the same as kinship, right? It's not the same as saying brother, sister, father, or mother. One's mother might be one's comrade, but when adding comrade, one is saying something else, something that mother does not include. One's designating a specific political relation, being on the same side of the struggle, one that is shared between the mother and child when they're comrades, but that exceeds their domestic, blood, or kinship relation. You can then, and so you can also then, of course, divide comrades. You can see how comradeship can attach to or divide all kinship relations, right? We can be related by blood without sharing a political relation with one another. Similarly, comrade is not the same as neighbor, right? Comrade doesn't designate physical or spatial proximity. It doesn't give an account of an obligation that comes from a shared sociality, right? You would never say, love thy comrade as thyself. And you wouldn't say that just living near someone makes you comrades, right? We can be part of the same locality without being comrades. Also, comrade is not like citizen, right? The citizen relation is mediated by the state. Comradeship exceeds the state. It does not take the state as its frame of reference. Right? We can have comrades all over the world. And it's one of the interesting things about that journal from this American journal, The Comrade, because you start to see how early US socialists are designating their sense of solidarity with socialists abroad, even as they're not part of one international or one party at that point. Also, as we're trying to see these differences between comrade and citizen, note how the state, I'm now thinking particularly of the US state, is fearful of communists, right? Afraid of communists as traitors, as those who have loyalties to an organization other than the state. Comrades then can oppose other citizens. And we can probably recall, folks are familiar from the US Cold War, comrade would also be used in a derogatory sense, right? To just point to or index people who were thought of as communists. Also, comrade, so it's not kinship, it's not neighbor, it's not citizenship, it's also not friendship. The friend is, particularly if we think of like Aristotle's classic account of friendship, friendship is a direct relation between two people for the benefit of each other. Aristotle talks about this as the friend looks for the virtue or the excellence of the other friend. Friendship is anchored in the person. But comradeship is broad, right? Bees and stars. Someone previously unknown, now revealed as a comrade. It extends through intimate relations to stretch into relations with those we don't know personally at all. Anyone can be a comrade, whether they like me or not, whether they are like me or not. So there's an element then of comradeship that has a kind of inhuman dimension. The comrade relation has nothing to do with the person or personality in its specificity. The comrade is generic, in a way inhuman. It's not concerned at all with personality, it's not concerned with the uniqueness, but with sameness. With the sameness in relation to a political struggle, being on the same side. So comradeship's not personal. And anti-communism often picks up on this, right? Anti-communism wants to bring out, individual personal fulfillment over and against the kind of disciplined, organized comrade being able to do what it takes, right? To put their personality aside in the service of the larger cause. These other relations, which I've used to distinguish and kind of set out the ground of comradeship, they can also help index degenerations of comradeship, errors that comrades can make, right? They might, comradeship might be substantialized via nationality. National Socialist and Fascist also use the term comrade as a form of address. Comradeship can sometimes end up substantialized with ethnicity or race. It can be mistaken for a relation supposed to benefit individuals, or it can be equated with relations mediated by the state. But what I want to claim is that all of those are separate relations and that we can analytically recognize comradeship as distinct from them. And then we can recognize how those relations can come into it and lead to various kinds of deformations. Okay, the third thesis then. Identity is the other of the comrade. Comradeship is not a relation of identity, right? We saw in Ninotchka that it's not about the specificity of being a woman. It abstracts from that. Comradeship is not specified in terms of identity categories. Oksana Timofeyeva has some writing on an artist where she notes that in comradeship, identity vanishes. And she gives the example of the masquerade used by Bolsheviks undercover, right? They would maybe have fake mustaches or masks on. Let me use another example of the kind of way that identity vanishes under comradeship and also the other of the comrade. A friend of mine, a comrade, was actually, I shouldn't say we're comrades. My comrade Hannah was telling me that there was one afternoon where she was texting me and someone else, another of our comrades, Derek, and she got us mixed up. The responses that we both gave were so identical that it didn't matter which one was from Derek and which was from me, right? The comradeship was carried through the text, regardless of which individual person it was. I actually had a similar weird thing happen when I was calling one person, and then who was a comrade in the party, and someone else answers the phone, and I can't tell, right? All of a sudden, like every voice just sounded like exactly the same to me. It's like I should have recognized the voice, but it didn't. It was like, oh, is this so-and-so or this so? The identity utterly vanished, right? So instead, there was this kind of interchangeable non-identity, but present instead a sort of generic comradeship. So anyone can be a comrade, but of course not everyone. I guess I should, because this will probably come up, use the scary, awful example of this also. From Brecht, The Measures Taken. You may recall this play, which has the play is about a trial of what they call the four agitators, who are four communists who are on trial before the Control Council, or like something like a central committee, and they're on trial because they've killed their young comrade. And the way the play sets out is the agitators describe having to go undercover and hiding their identities to they're trying to reach Chinese workers, and each of them has to wear a mask, efface their identity, and as Brecht writes, they have to be nameless and without a past, empty pages on which the revolution may write its instructions, end quote. So the agitators all put on Chinese masks and then appear as Chinese rather than as German and Russian. Once they get into China, the young comrade is totally outraged by the awful conditions that the Chinese workers are having to endure, and so he wants to get to work immediately on like helping out and trying to get them radicalized right away, and so he substitutes his judgment for the parties and for the plan, and then exposes them all. He tears up and he tears off his mask and then tears it up. But then this exposes them, and so they have to race to escape the city. But now that he's recognizable, he's a liability, and so they have to kill him. And he agrees, right? So they shoot him, and they throw him into a lime pit that burns away all traces of him and return to their work. Comrades are multiple and interchangeable. They are elements in collectives, like collections. The mask lets us see a kind of interchangeability. But even in a more everyday term, like in German, they often use Kamerad to refer to school kids. School kids will call each other Comrade. In other languages, particularly Romance languages, earlier versions of Comrade were people who shared a room or traveled together. Again, it's the sameness that makes them comrades, the sameness with respect to what they're doing and where they're going. Going to school, taking a trip, fighting for the revolution. One other I want to point out on this interchangeability. In the post-1991 Russian context, in the transition to capitalism, the term comrade became discredited. And my comrade, Alla Ivanchikova, was telling me that there's a political struggle being fought through etymologies, that some recent etymologies are trying to depoliticize comrade, and they're trying to mock the word. And in their etymologies, emphasize comradeship comes from tovar, which is a commodity or a good for sale. And Alla was telling me that this actually, for them, this exposes, or no, this idea that comradeship is really based in a commodity, they think serves the purpose of showing that underneath all talk of camaraderie, they're just monetary and market relations that rule the day and always have. Any comrade is a commodity if you pay the right price. So that's, Allah is saying like how these etymologies are being fought out. The counter-etymologies insist that comrade is a much older word, that it derives from an ancient word for military camp and from the way soldiers would call themselves comrades. But note here, even in the etymological warfare in contemporary Russia, both sides agree on a shared assumption of sameness, interchangeability, whether or not it comes from commodity or from fellow travelers. Comrade nevertheless highlights something in common. It's a commonality that arises not out of identity, not out of who we are or what one is, but of what we're doing, right? Fighting, traveling, studying, being exchanged. Revolutionary usage champions this common condition, this equality and sameness against hierarchies of class and caste, sex and gender, and race in the U.S. In the U.S. history, the Communist Party the Communist Party centered the struggle against white supremacy. It thought of that as a core aspect of the struggle against capitalism. The party emphasized that socialist revolution was impossible in the U.S. without revolutionary unity of blacks and whites. And one of the an early party member, Harry Haywood, writes really well about this. For Haywood and other mid-20th century U.S. communists, comrade was not a raced relation, but a relation of equality opposed to white supremacy and other forms of hierarchy. So again, this third proposition, or preliminary one, is that comrade designates a generic political relation. It doesn't specify. Any one comrade is as good as or equivalent to any other to the extent that they are comrades. And this, of course, can be aspirational, right? The development of kinds of political consciousness and kinds of skill and kinds of work. The fourth one, the relation between comrades is mediated by fidelity to a truth. Readers of Badiou will hear that resonance. So comrades are those who are on the same side. They're related not by identity, but by action, by doing, by the actions undertaken together. Their fidelity to the horizon of their actions, to its truth, establishes the expectations that comrades have of themselves and of each other. Right? How are they realizing the goal? And it's always work, work, work. Keep working, work for this, work for the revolution. So relations between comrades then arise from this outward orientation, this orientation toward the goal. Everything depends on that. And I was actually wondering, maybe that's the reasons that there's so little written specifically about comrade relationships, because it's not that they're primarily concerned with their relations to each other, but it's always oriented outward to the work, right? The struggle for justice, right? For the, on behalf of the working class, for the revolution. So then the work is maintaining the collective, helping it endure. And then the values associated with that kind of maintenance and endurance include solidarity, collective spirit, building confidence and enthusiasm, right? Instilling courage. The work towards the goal requires solidarity, courage, and enthusiasm. It also requires studying, demonstrating, striking, right? Doing the work of the collective, and often then criticizing, learning from the criticisms, and planning. So comradeship is a relation then that requires a great deal of discipline. It's a disciplining relation, one where being a comrade works back on a person to make them more than they were before. And this working back is not dependent on consensus, right? Comrades can err, right? Everyone knows the history of communism and socialism is filled with constant disagreement and criticism. But comradeship is the frame for agreement and disagreement. It's a frame that functions in a way like a ground. The expectations that they have the expectations comrades have of each other in relation to the fact that they're on the same side and in the same struggle. When that fidelity to the kind of truth that orients them is broken, then they're not comrades. I came across this, I've seen this reference, and I can't dig up the exact location of it, but people saying that, oh, there's a famous passage from Rosa Luxemburg from the Paris meeting in 1901 or 1902, where she says to Edward Bernstein, "You are not my comrade." If anybody knows where you can find that exact site, I'd appreciate it, because I'm looking for it, and it might just be apocryphal, but it's still good, right? There are limits, right? You're not always a comrade. So that's that's the last kind of provisional thesis right now. I want to bring this to a close by saying something why I think this might be plausible now. I think it might be plausible as a way through what I see as the impasse. I call this the impasse of survivors and systems. I think that there's two fairly dominant tendencies on the contemporary left. On the one hand, there's a great deal of concern still with politics of identity and languages of intersectionality. And we see this a lot on college campuses, but also in social media, some activist networks, not all of them. On the other hand, we also see a certain post-humanism, right? It's kind of emphases on geology and the planetary time, on algorithms, on objects, on exhaustion. So we have these two really distinct tendencies on the contemporary left, right? I call them survivors, right, for the identity people, because that becomes a kind of primary locus of energy as the survivor, and then the systems, right, the geology and the extinction and the algorithms. I think that these tendencies, survivors and systems, correspond to neoliberal capitalism's dismantling of social institutions, the intensification of capitalism via networked media and informatization. Right? Jobs are less reliable and more precarious. People change their occupations much more. Universities, schools, families, unions, they're all less stable. They're more in flux. The dismantling of social welfare protections has made people the locus of all responsibility. It's up to each individual to make sure that, that their lives are successful, even as the institutions that would help them develop those capacities start to unravel. Carl Schmitt said that liberalism was characterized by ethics and economics. I think we should say neoliberalism is characterized then by this survivors and systems, right? Neoliberalism enjoins a kind of individualized self-cultivation, self-management, self-reliance, self-absorption, at the same time that it furthers impersonal determining processes, circuits, and systems. So there's this responsible individual in a situation that is utterly determining and outside their control. So again, instead of ethics and economics, neoliberalism's effacement of the political manifests as survivors and systems. The former struggle to persist in conditions of unlivability rather than to seize and transform these conditions. The latter are positioned as objects or settings that totally determine us. Sometimes they're figured as aesthetic objects or objects of a future aesthetics, something perhaps to view and diagram, to predict or mourn, but never to affect. And so what I think that thinking in terms of the party as an institution where we can accept, yes, it makes demands that are utterly inhuman, that it still nevertheless responds to where we are, a situation where there's a saturation of identity, where we also see the power of number, where we see the emergence of generic signifiers like hashtags, repetitions of common images and forms, and where the movements themselves are forcing again the question of the party, as the movements have come up against the limits of identity, horizontality, and the politics of alliance that presupposes fixed identity. So if if we want to think that we can actually have politics, we can't go in a direction of the utterly bereft survivors trying to survive on their own, or the direction of utter systems and geologies and algorithms that completely determine us. We have to think in the middle ground of the institutions and practices through which we can address both sides of these. And I think comradeship can help point a way forward, that can do that. Okay, so that's, maybe we can talk about this. So. I don't know how to turn, oh, there we go. How do we turn, okay, good.
My question is, you mentioned a lot of different, you differentiated comradeship from a lot of different types of relations, the family, the state. How would you differentiate it from like a religion?
So the first thing is, I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I would be a little bit worried about making a general statement about religions first, because I think that there are different understandings of adherence to a religion depending on what the religion is, right? So that I think, I mean, my sense is that that to be Christian, to be Jewish, to be Muslim, to be Buddhist, to be Hindu, that they mean different things within each of those religions. So that's why I wouldn't want to, that's why I didn't start in that direction. Yeah. Okay, so, I mean, well, okay. One thing that actually is sort of interesting about about Christianity, I mean, that's a terrible sentence, right? One thing. But you know, there's, I think it's in the book of Matthew. There's a part where Jesus is saying something like, you know, whoever follows me will leave their family and leave their, you know, husband or their wife or their children or something like that. So there's this kind of fascinating, I would say an anti-humanist Christian moment with a belonging there. That's kind of interesting there. There's some, I think that comradeship has a degree of that. That's the first thing. But I'd also say that, you know, religion tends to be what, maybe this is unfair, man, I don't really think a whole lot about religion. Maybe, I think religion tends to be about an individual's soul, I mean Christianity, an individual's soul and salvation, and not about the political project of you know, abolishing capitalism and producing another world. I mean, it should, and in fact, I mean, there is a version of Christianity that can do that, and you know, the Dorothy Day kinds of liberation struggles have done pretty cool combinations of Christianity and you know, a kind of communism or socialism. So I don't think they have to be antithetical, but I think that like one is materialist, the other one is idealist and begins with the soul. And this one is kind of, yeah, so how is that for? Does that help? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, a quick question about the Chinese connotations of Tongzhi, which from what I understand doubles as companion, as a very generic kind of companionship. But I've understood this term as being at odds with the official use of comrade, where the LGBT connotations of it are subversive, right? For a companionship which is not part of the official use. When the government in China will say 同志, right? That it does not mean these things, right? But when people on the street say to each other 同志, it's with a wink, everyone knows what it means. So it's also comes with with a huge dose of social cynicism, right? So there's a huge kind of cynical part to the use of the term, right? So a split.
So I don't want to call that cynical. I would want to say that rather than it being cynical, it's a reappropriation of the emancipatory egalitarian energy of the term against its betrayal by a communist party that is actually an operator for capitalism. And so I think, so I would want to call it a critical reappropriation. And I think that that's also fair, right? And so in some ways when, there's still that little Gorky element, even in what seems cynical, right? Because you're not saying, when you've got the kind of wonderful queer dimension, you're not dissing your queer comrade at all, right? That's a great moment of solidarity. So yeah, I want to, let's not call it cynical.
Hi, I was wondering what your thoughts were on sort of the kind of authoritarian capitalism of Trump, in this current era, and how indeed many of us perhaps were expecting Sanders to be sort of undermined as a socialist, and that never really fully emerged. Also, many of us perhaps were expecting Sanders to be undermined as Jewish, and to use the old Cold War connection between, sort of communism, socialism, and Jewishness. And so I was just curious as to why you thought it didn't play out that way.
I think I love this question. I think there are a few reasons. One, right, the kids want communism, right? Younger people recognize the failure of the capitalist system, and Bernie was able to ride that. Also, he didn't let them red baiting. Like when Trump said something, I don't remember exactly the details, but Trump had called him a communist, and then I think it was an interviewer asked Bernie what he thought about that, and he's like, "Oh, I think that's the nicest thing he's ever said about me." Right? So that's wonderful, right? He didn't disavow it, and so it didn't have any sting. And I think that part is super. Yeah, I think it's great for all of us, and we should all claim that and return to the party. The other part, though, is on the old Cold War connection. Isn't it? I think that we're seeing a weirdness from the Democratic Party and their bizarre obsession with Putin and Russia. Why? What is that? I think that this is a displaced version of their anti-communism. That they recognize that Sanders. He's not obviously communist. That Sanders is going to be lukewarm socialism. Is so much more powerful in this country than the horrible neoliberalism of the Democratic Party, and they can't let them. They can't think it. So what is the repressed where do they deposit then this repressed socialism that they have to disavow? Put it back in Russia, and thinking that it's still subverting that it's subverting the country and hurting the election and all of the sort of bizarre stuff that makes very few people even care about. So I think that we've seen it in a kind of displaced and distorted form. That's what's happened to the red baiting aspect of it. What about the Jewish? I can't say anything intelligible on that score. I was pretty. I think everyone was glad that there wasn't like a kind of anti-Semitic tenor to the election. Wait, what's this? After now it's out there, but that part. Wouldn't we say though that Trump's pretty much he hates a lot of folks, right? So there's anti-Semitism, there's racism, there's really horrific transphobia. So I think that the office of the Trump administration is also hatred of immigrants is really strong, and so and anti-Semitism is also part of that.
So I'm just curious, what on the ground, like as individuals who face, cynicism and just this sense of hopelessness every day, like what are daily actions and daily things that you would, like what should we,
Political collectives, political collectivity. I would actually say a socialist or communist party. It makes a huge difference. Your actions don't seem they're not trapped on just you by yourself. And even if you do sort of local actions, they're not just local. They become something broader. They become part of a broader set of work. I think that we get hopeless when it's one person surviving against all of these systems, right? The changing climate without a kind of structure around them. So I think the answer is the party.
Hi, Jodi. I apologize for being late. I missed the allies part, so...
I didn't talk about allies, so that's all right.
Oh, well, okay. So maybe you will now. This was great. What I heard is brilliant, as usual. But Comrade, I actually never really thought about it. That's what's so great about it, that it's something that predates, as you yourself told us, communism and the Communist Party. Just as party, I don't think necessarily implies the Communist Party. So if we were to want to value comradeship over friendship, say, which I'm totally open to for the reasons you gave, why would that necessarily imply a communist comradeship and a communist party, given that that's probably not going to happen in our lifetimes here in the United States?
So what's not going to happen in our lifetimes?
That we're going to become communist comrades that can make a difference politically. As Bernie himself has demonstrated that, he's basically a New Deal Democrat, which I think is a wonderful thing. Why couldn't we be comrades that work together to make the Democratic Party more democratically accountable and overcome our neoliberal survivorship?
I begin from the political position that, and I assume everybody does, but maybe I'm wrong, but that we have to abolish capitalism and establish communism. I think communism is the horizon of left action. Right? That's my beginning point, and I don't think it makes sense to think about a left that doesn't take that as the horizon of our action. So, for that reason, okay, so that's one. Two, the Democratic Party doesn't think of its members as comrades. It doesn't involve, what do you do as a Democrat? You give money and you vote. Right? That's not what comrades do. That's not fighting on a revolution. That's not a revolutionary battle. That doesn't require anything of anyone. Right? So I guess full stop. Next paragraph. As a tactic, does it make sense to do an entryist kind of politics? So one has, and there are groups that do this, right? That understand they're comrades, they're members of another party, but they might act within the Democratic Party. I don't have a problem with that, but their comradeship comes from their participation in something else. Next point. So there's an interesting thing to think to. And now maybe this part, Sandy, will be better in keeping with the spirit of your question, since I did a bunch of So in some obscure letter, Marx invokes the difference between the historical and the formal party, where the historical party he associates with a kind of broad historical trajectory of an emancipatory egalitarian struggle. He said once. Talking about the Paris Commune, he talked about it as the enormous achievement of our party, right? But it wasn't the achievement of the party, in any kind of concrete sense, but it was as a kind of abstracted understanding of what being a member of a party could be. I don't think that's enough, but if it takes a couple of years of people imagining themselves in a historical communist party to get people then to take the next step, then I'm good with that. But I think that we've got to recognize that real political struggle takes effort and requires sacrifice and requires work and is not something that is just comes about by going through our everyday lives and giving money and writing an editorial now and then and voting. Right? I mean, if people really think that things are horrible, right? Like the healthcare plan that the Congress just passed, the climate change, the unbearable and increasing economic inequality. If we take that seriously, then our actions need to correspond to them. There's something that I find deeply frustrating about a left that has an incredibly radical language, but no radical action that goes with it. Like, if you don't want to be radical, that's okay. I know there are liberals, and there are people who can do liberal politics, and that's fine. But then the political self-understanding should be different from how a radical left understands itself.
Hello. I'm not English, English is not my first language. And for me, I was really trying to translate your comrade back into the languages that I otherwise know. And I'm German, so for me, for example, I cannot reappropriate Kamerad because
Parteigenossen.
Genosse is something, Genosse can be used, and I was also playing around with that in my head, but that also brings me actually to my question because I was really thinking do I want to have a personification of an action, or do I want to claim certain kind of actions as being something that I see as a political horizon? And that might be something else than you have in mind. Because apparently, Comrade is for me also, it is geared towards a party. That's what the word is standing for. So I was actually wondering, so why is the party so important for you? Or could it also be something like standing in solidarity? There has also been a lot of social movements that work across different lines than, because parties are also aimed at a state, for example, and so forth. So why is it the party for you? Is there nothing to think about except to work within a certain kind of state formation where parties can also have a different form of use, let's say. We've seen that as well, right?
Sure. Okay, so first I want to situate this there are movements, right? We all, I would assume, have some relation to political movements at present and over the last 10 or 20 years, right? Whether or not it is participating in marches, organizing demonstrations, being part of the political movement of our time. And that's been something. The movements also come up against limits that come from the state and the economy. And the question then is, can movements on their own affect the kind of economic and political transformation that the movements claim are their goals? It seems to me that in the last 30 or 40 years, we have had a time, right, so essentially since the left really lost all kind of connection with radical parties and really went into emphasis completely on movements really critical of the party form, that we can have a great deal of energy, but we keep getting blocked. And I think that's also why parties have returned as matters of left intense interest and investigation right now. So the thing is, movements are there. It's not like my emphasis on the party denies movements, but what I want to encourage is folks to recognize the limits of movements and to see how to address, how to go further requires a more organized political form. So that's the reason for the emphasis on the party rather than just movements. The left loves movements, but the movements don't require that much of people, right? And this goes back to some of the problems with allyship, right? Allyship presupposes that the identities are given and the politics associated with an identity are there. They don't presuppose that we are now in one struggle for a common future. It presupposes multiple identity struggles that then want someone to support them rather than a single side in a political struggle. So that's, so it also goes back with Sandy's question. I don't know if that addressed what your point was. I can go back again if there was something else, if I missed half of it.
But another way to think about ally is that ally is speaking to something about people. Some people have a collective experience of the conditions which have given rise to the struggle, which is different from other people. And the people who have more privilege in relation to that struggle need to be allying with the people who are more directly affected by the conditions which have given rise to that struggle. And I would think that one critique of comradeship is that it flattens out that differentiation of experience which gives rise to the struggle, right? So as a straight, white, middle-class male, I have a different relationship to the conditions of struggle that are going on in this country now than other people in this room, right? So in calling ourselves comrades, we speak to a shared sense of the liberation we will all experience as a result of the struggle succeeding, but we risk flattening out what our experience of those conditions are, right? What we bring to that struggle.
I wouldn't call that a risk. I'd call that a benefit, right? This isn't one of the interesting things. The comrade concept doesn't begin with the experiences of people. Right? There's an anti-humanism here. It begins with, it begins with we're on the same side of a struggle. Now, and that struggle is where the fight. Our actions are, we coordinate our actions because of this fight. The politics of it don't come from individuals' experiences. That's not the locus of it, right? Instead, they come from, in this part I'm actually going back and forth on the one. I like the Badurian fidelity to a truth event, and what I keep wondering is, do I want to say that it's an event that hasn't happened or an event that has happened? I think I want it both ways, right? Which I don't think is crazy, right? You can do this with ideas of retroactive determination and the position of the party, and I've got some other writing I've done to try to figure out these temporalities. But it's the thought is an emancipatory egalitarian struggle against capitalism and for a communist future. So this is it's not beginning in experiences. Now, that does not mean that let's say a party, as it is responding to the present, would ignore the experiences around people. That doesn't mean that at all. It just means that the comrade concept is not one that's coming out of experiences. And I think that's a benefit. I think that we've gotten really bogged down in thinking that our politics depend on everything that depend on our life stories rather than our common struggle. Friends depend on your life stories. And most people end up really frustrated in political groups because people can act like jerks and all sorts of stuff. They're not friends. But if the expectation is not that these are your friends, but these are comrades because you're working for you're working for this goal, then there's a little bit of the investment goes away. The investment is redirected. You don't expect of your comrades the same things you would expect as a friend. So I think experiences are really important for friendship.
So I'm curious about what the sort of theory of power underlying this concept of comrade is, because I see what you mean about having a common political horizon, because that is the necessary condition of what you're describing. I think that you can only set aside, or even think that you're setting aside, personal experiences when you can identify that goal and what it is, which requires a sense of who has power, how is it achieved, and I wonder where, class struggle specifically fits into this, and how, what is the path? Instead of just having comradeship in the sort of Gorky sense be a magical thing where I touch Brian and suddenly we're comrades. What is the goal? And I mean, you can say what is the goal, which is the abolishing capitalism. But what are the steps?
I actually think building a stronger Communist Party. Now I mean small c. I don't mean the American Communist Party is a joke. Right? I mean, there are other left, good, interesting, exciting left parties in the U.S., and that's not one of them, unfortunately. And so let's say Communist Party, small c, then maybe roughly imagined as something like Syriza, if we could imagine the different the left small parties combining together. So I think the theory of power is first recognize the necessity of organized collectivity rather than just movementism, rather than individual actions and individual choices. Right? So the theory of power is one of organized party collectives.
Yeah, sorry, a question just to sort of follow immediately on that. I think the obvious hurdle to that is, sorry, the intense social, it's okay. A clear hurdle to that is the intense social, racial class segregation that we experience already. I can call my comrades in my organizing group comrades, but it is the case that that group, which is largely self-selective, it doesn't come out of a workplace with thousands of workers, has a lot of things in common that we would identify as sort of identity categories. So when you are already so, even just architecturally segregated from other people who you want to be comrades with, how does that process even begin?
So I'll use one specific example. I'll just speak personally. I hate using personal examples, but so I'm a college professor in a small college town. Not really a place where I'm exposed to a huge, diverse set of people. But as a member of the party I'm involved with, that party is not primarily academics at all. It has it's got people in different cities, and most of the people in the cities are young and really diverse, and they don't organize primarily at universities at all. And so, in fact, my world is larger because, I'm expanded out of the kind of milieu I would be part of as an academic because of the party. Right, it's opened into other places because it's not around identity, right? It's about the common struggle, and so so the thing is when you find the pre-existing parties, right? They take you out of your small milieu. I don't mean you small. I mean that.
Hi, Jodi. Congratulations on another project that's going to be very compelling. It's Carolyn, we've met. And
I just can't see because you're dark and this white light here, but that's okay.
I wanted to ask you about a potential source of hierarchy among comrades that didn't come up during your talk. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask about identity or intersectionality. I've lost enough comrades over that, and I've come to realize that the conversation just needs to continue for a while. But because we disagree on that. But I'd like you to talk about the idea of leadership and how that might function in relation to the figure of the comrade, maybe vanguardism might be a way of thinking about it, but it seems like there's always someone who starts things or has more access to resources, perhaps because they're affiliated with an academic institution. Anyway, I'd like you to talk about the idea of leadership and hierarchy. Thank you.
Yeah, first, it's so interesting. It seems to me that many on the left think vanguardism is a bad thing. And yet, weirdly, culturally, like early adopters are the cool kids, right? Like all the techno, visionary, brand new early adopter things people think are great, right? Being fashion forward, also praised. But somehow, politically, vanguardism is discounted. I think, and in my book, The Communist Horizon, I try to position Occupy as a vanguard. Right? I think that was totally a vanguard in the best and most wonderful and inspiring ways. So I think that we should recognize that that vanguardism isn't bad. So that's the first thing. Additionally, leaders, almost any form of social or political group is going to have leaders in it. Right? We know that what some of the problems that horizontalist movements have had is leaders emerge, but nobody can acknowledge it. And then people get paranoid. And then everything starts to fall apart. And because there's no way to hold them accountable, because you can't even acknowledge that they exist. So I think that leaders are, I mean, it's not just me. It's like, in the book Crowds and Party, I have a chapter about Robert Michels and his account of the iron law of oligarchy, which many people like to use as an argument against the party because parties end up having leadership structures. And the thing is what they leave out is that Michels uses it against he uses it against democracy, he uses it against anarchy. It's like any kind of political organizing requires some sort of leadership. So why not acknowledge them and then have mechanisms for making them accountable, right? That seems to me to make a great deal of sense. So I'll just, in my, I do some organizing work in my community, and one of the things that we try to do is make sure that different people run, when we've got, like, it's a complicated structure, but when we do public things, we make sure that that different people lead that. That it's not just like, we don't want the leadership associated with one person, particularly one of the few of us who is a college professor, right? That's just not good for anybody. And we also, because it's an ongoing thing, we also recognize that everybody needs skills and no one person is indispensable. And so if you make sure that everybody has skills, then you can solidify the fact that, and that's the thing with Comrades, right? No one person is indispensable. Everybody matters. And everybody has to be able to have the different skill set. So leaders will emerge, hierarchies emerge, and then you can hold them accountable, and you can have different kinds of structures to move people in and out of it. But I think that rather than thinking hierarchy and leadership is bad, what we have to think is hierarchy and leadership are inevitable. How do you keep them from getting fixed? How do you prevent them from being that have the same people hold on to them? How do you make them more open? And that's, I mean, liberalism has worked on that for years. So it's weird that the left gets so bogged down on the fact of leaders, and I don't think we should.
So, assuming that there's a leader and a hierarchy and a party structure, who has the power to decide who's a comrade? Do you get to choose? I mean, is it just a thing that I feel like I'm comrades with you, or is there a top-down structure that determines who's in and who's out of the?
That's interesting. There's that depends a lot on local cultures. So, for example, I was asking Greek friends, and they're like, yeah, in Syria, everybody calls each other a comrade. And they would say comrade to people in KKE, right? That's the old Stalinist party. And, but the KKE people wouldn't address the series of people as comrades. So, but it's sort of a culture thing. In some in other places, comrade has moved away, and people use was it campo or capo, a much more casual form. But I think that's also as the groups have become sort of less disciplined and less oriented around a communist horizon. So it's a local culture issue. In some parties, it will be when you're a party member, you're a comrade. And then, but then some other people might want to call anybody who's a fellow traveler also a comrade. And it varies it varies by context, it varies historically.
Could you briefly take us through, your kind of revitalization of communism in the context of what happened in Russia and then in China in the contemporary context? I mean, I'm sure you do in some of your writing, but if you can kind of quickly give us the sort of your context for this sort of your new this new emergent idea of communism in relation to the failure elsewhere.
So, I mean, my definition of communism is totally old school, right? From each according to ability to each according to need. And I think the fact that there have been historical mistakes doesn't mean that the idea is wrong, right? I mean, I actually think they're mistakes, right? I mean, democracy took thousands of years of struggle to become an ideal. It wasn't the case that, once again the tyrant slaughtered the peasants, I guess we're not going to have democracy. Or once again this happened, or once again, oh no, we have French Revolution, guillotine, guess we don't have democracy, don't want to be Democrats. I mean, ideals with power are going to go through instances of failure. And then the thing is to think, are we so determined historically by past failures that we can't do it better again? I don't think so. And I actually think that the alternative is worse. The alternative is the only response we have to global capitalist inequality and climate change is writing letters, voting every couple of years, and marching down the street. That's not enough. Well, let's see, communist parties historically do all sorts of different things, right? So they publish literature. They try to instill in people another way of thinking about things. There's party schools, there's party theater groups, there's all sorts of writing, but it's not just about going to a protest. It's building relations in the community. It's helping, it's providing theoretical languages and ideas for workers in their unions and in their workplaces. I mean, right now, a site where I see a lot of excitement is recognizing how climate struggles and environmental struggles are really key for communist organizing, right? If we think about historically, one of the things that made workplace organizing good was the fact that you have so many people there. When you have these cities with, like Flint, or where I live, Geneva, New York, we've got a terrible problem, like the communities of working class people and a large number of whom are Spanish speakers or people of color. They've been infested by lead and arsenic for over 30 or 40 years, and the city council didn't tell them. The organizing around these contamination issues in the sacrifice zone is a site for actual communist organizing as well, not just liberal, your property is violated, but all of us are affected, right? This is a group. The only way to move forward is as a group. So that's not just marching around.
Taking into account the sort of differences in like local definitions of who's a comrade, this could actually just be like a yes or no answer, but do you think that the willingness to be a martyr is sort of a prerequisite to being a comrade?
That's a super question, though I sort of hate it. So, the question gives it a religious connotation. And it also has a connotation that there is something deeply important and valuable about individuality, right? Because individuality is now being associated with the soul and with some way, so.
I don't really mean it to have the religious connotation. I'm thinking of it like in the Brecht example that you brought up, this idea that like actually you have to be willing to give up the individuality.
Yeah.
But like to the point of.
I mean, you know, I think right now in the U.S., you know, the point of death seems a little bit, unlikely. But you know, you have to do stuff that your political work is not oriented around your own self-interest, right? It's not about doing something because it's for you. It's not about your recognition, and I don't mean you, right? I mean, it's not about one's recognition or one's own. No one gets actively involved as a communist because it's great for them as an individual, right? That's not what it is. And so, yeah, there are degrees. I mean, it's like, what was it? Was it Oscar Wilde who said something like the problem with socialism is so many meetings? That's sort of true, right? I mean, you go to like freaking all the stuff, that's all you ever do, if you're not marching around. So I wouldn't want to call it martyring, but I would say it is, and this is why Kollontai and Gorky, right? It's in opposition to the egoism of capitalist society or bourgeois society. It's a break with that. And the thing is I think everyone should be excited about this because I in fact think that at least half of the kinds of theoretical work that people find exciting today is already going against kinds of cultivated individualities with all of the system stuff. And so I find it a little bit surprising, like the same people who can be, you know, really into like, you know, exhaustion and objects and you know, all sorts of like flows and algorithms, all of a sudden when faced with communism, like, oh my God, the individual. It's like, wait a minute, didn't they already get extinct? I mean, like, there's a way that, in fact, I would think that we can get some of the theoretical resonance or energy from some of that stuff and recognize there's already a lot in current thinking that goes that says that we don't need to hold on to the individual figure anymore. And also, the first two chapters of Crowds and Party have a whole bunch of that line of argument if people are into it or not into it.
Thank you so much, Jodi, for this incredible talk. It's wonderful to hear the critique of ultra-leftism embodied so beautifully in the 21st century. It's especially satisfying because I get to play the ultra-leftist, which I don't usually do in these conversations. Usually I'm doing the Leninist line, so I'm delighted to inhabit my filthy, decadent, petty bourgeois ultra-leftist position. But building off of these religious questions, which I think are super interesting, certainly the question of which Abrahamic sect intersects most consistently with the history of communism, whether it's the international of the Catholic Church or the sort of urban scholarly qualities that have historically been associated with Judaism, whether it's the weird, imminent, potentially anti-patriarchal Protestant history, or whether it's the sort of new Islamist, Leninist political practice. You know, you can find all kinds of resonances. The one that interested me, though, in this talk is, and this is me in my full autonomous position, is your valorization of work and self-sacrifice and all of these sort of classically Lutheran, classically Weberian Protestant work ethic qualities. And can these truly be recovered for a kind of communism, or do we not also have to refuse with Tronti a certain injunction to work and suffer for our redemption?
I think there's a difference between political work and working for the man, right? Working for capitalism. Right? This is not work that's, I mean, basically for political work you don't get paid. And so you're outside of that wage relation. And I think that matters, right? And I also think it matters for how do we, I mean, I hate prefiguration, but if we want to think that that the revolution generates the subjects, its own subjects, what will we do after capitalism? We will have had to develop forms of working together that are not capitalist mediated by capital. So it's work in that sense. I do think at some point I'm going to have to kind of do a kind of proper version of this via Trump tape. I mean, I take that as a fair point. That's a fair point. But I think I've got an answer, right? It's not capitalist order.
Sounds good. Is that, are we?
Ready to stop? Good.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, guys.
Thank you, everybody.